Men like you always do the arithmetic out loud.
You've never met men my size.
Men like you always do the arithmetic out loud. Rosalie Marchang said it to the room because the room had been doing arithmetic on her for 32 minutes without once using her name. What is she worth? What does the bakery clear in winter? How much goodwill survives a neighborhood fire? How much prettier was she at 25? How old is too old to sell as a bride and still call it elegant? No one reached for a glass. No one shifted in a chair. 48 people in the old Devereux Opera House. And the silence landed so hard it felt upholstered. The chandeliers had been imported from Venice in 1891 and rewired 3 times since. The velvet curtains were the color of old wine. The ledger on the walnut table was newer than everything else in the room and more dangerous than all of it. At the far end, a man spoke for the first time. "You've never met men my size." That was the first time Rosalie Marchang heard Matteo Vascari's voice. It was not loud, it did not hurry. It sounded like a man who had spent his whole life being obeyed and had somehow not let that make him lazy. She would remember later that she had not been frightened of him then. She had been frightened of her brother with his cufflinks on wrong. Of Renard Gallo with his dry old hands on the ledger. Of the 2 men by the stage doors who had the expression of people prepared to carry furniture or women with the same professionalism. But not of Matteo Vascari. He was the only person in the room who had answered her. Before we continue, if you enjoy emotional mafia romance stories filled with unforgettable characters, impossible choices, and powerful endings, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to the night everything changed. They called it a reconciliation. The invitation had called it an autumn supper for the benefit of several old families with interests along the river. What it actually was, once every October, was a settling of accounts too ugly for banks and too old for courts. Cargo routes, insurance claims, silence. Political favors, a warehouse, a dock, and when a man ran out of everything else, a daughter or a sister or a widow with no lawyer and bad luck. Rosalie was 35 years old. She had run a 19-seat bakery in the Bywater for 12 years. Beginning at 2:30 every morning while the city was still deciding whether it had finished the night before. She knew the exact sound butter made when it was too cold to laminate properly. She knew which suppliers lied before Mardi Gras and which ones lied after. She had a right wrist that clicked in wet weather from kneading dough 6 days a week since she was 19. And a scar across the heel of her left hand where she had once caught a sugar burn so deep it left her unable to close her fingers for a month. She was not a girl. Her brother Luke had put the bakery up first. Then the apartment above it. Then the delivery van that had already barely belonged to them. And then, 3 Thursdays earlier, in a private room over a restaurant on Magazine Street, with 2 men listening and a fountain pen already uncapped. He had put up her. She found out 7 days before the reconciliation. He told her in the bakery while she was glazing apricot tarts. There is a particular kind of betrayal in being told a thing monstrous enough to ruin your life, while doing something small enough that your hands keep moving. She remembered that. The pastry brush kept going. The glaze kept shining. Luke kept saying words like temporary and ceremonial and protection and old custom, which are the sort of words men use when they are trying to smuggle cruelty through the front door, dressed as family obligation. She had looked at him for a long moment and said, "Did you use my full name when you sold me, or was Rosalie enough?" He had flinched. That, more than the confession, was when she understood it was true. Now here she was under chandeliers. In a black dress she had not chosen, while Renard Gallo turned pages with the care of a priest and the appetite of a butcher. 2 women had already been walked out by the time her family's debt was called. Rosalie had not known there were others. That had been its own surprise. She had spent a week believing she was the only woman in the world being fed into some antique machine, and then walked into the opera house and found 3 others near the stage curtain, all standing very straight. A widow in navy with her mouth set hard. A girl of maybe 22 in silver shoes too thin for October. A redhead in a green dress with the posture of somebody who had once had dancing lessons and was using every one of them not to shake. Rosalie had looked at them and thought, absurdly, like a baker noticing the wrong thing during a fire, that none of them had eaten. Then Renard Gallo had cleared his throat. Marchand, he said. Luc Marchand, principal and penalties. 680,000 standing since Easter. Security exhausted. Creditor of record, Mr. Vascari. And that was when Rosalie said what she said about men like him. Because by then silence had become a worse humiliation than speech, Matteo Vascari did not stand right away. He was 38, black suit, no ring, dark hair cut short. One white thread at his right temple, as if time had touched him there with a fingertip and been told that was enough. He had been seated with a clear view of both exits and had not eaten a thing, while the other men at the table had spoken over one another in the expensive, tired way of people born into power. Matteo had watched. Now he unfolded a single page from inside his jacket. Then he stood, and half the room forgot to breathe properly. "Read me the clause," he said. Renard looked up over his glasses. "Which one?" "The one that says what I am entitled to." Renard read it. It took a while because the language was the sort that turns a violent act into something that sounds notarized and respectable. When he was done, Matteo nodded once and walked away from the table. Not around it, away from it. Past Rosalie's brother, past the stage, past the old men and their water glasses and little private empires, until he was standing directly in front of her. He did not touch her, he said. "Rosalie Marchand, if I invoke the clause, every competing claim on your family's debt dies tonight." Renard's head came up. Matteo did not look at him. "If I don't," he went on, his eyes still on Rosalie's face. "The debt is reopened to the room." The widow by the curtain made a small sound in her throat. The girl in silver shoes went pale. Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. "And what exactly do you call invoking it?" He did glance at the table then, and something in that glance made three men look down. "Not what they call it," he said then, to the room. "I claim the Marchand paper." A chair scraped hard against wood. Somebody said his name. One of the men by the wall shifted his weight as if readying for trouble. But Matteo lifted a hand an inch and the room settled around that hand like filings around a magnet. Then he did the second thing nobody in that room expected. "I am also dissolving the Cormier claim and the Bellucci claim effective now. Those notes transfer to my holding company at noon." The widow in navy blinked once. The girl in silver shoes gripped the edge of the curtain so hard her knuckles lost color. Renard went white around the mouth. "You cannot come into this room and dismantle custom because you've developed a taste for theater." "I can if I own the paper." "You bought those debts without notice." "Yes, there are rules." Matteo looked at him with enormous patience. There were women. The silence after that had shape to it. Rosalie stood in black silk in the middle of an underworld supper and watched a man with a calm voice and very steady hands take a match to the machinery of the evening simply by deciding he would. He turned back to her. "Here is what happens next," he said. "In 1 hour, before a judge, we sign a civil contract good for 40 days. During those 40 days, nobody in this room comes near you, your property, your family, or your business without going through me first. On the 40th day, if you want out, the annulment is already signed on my side. If you stay past that, it will be because you chose to. Not because your brother lost at cards, not because an old man read your name from a book. Because you chose to." Rosalie stared at him. "Why?" She said. He folded the paper once. "Because you were right about the men in this room. And you're different." "No," Matteo said. "I'm bigger, that matters more." It was the worst possible answer and somehow not a lie. A minute later, the room began making noise again. The cautious kind first, then the outraged kind, then the calculating kind. Renard Gallo demanded order. Luc Marchand demanded to speak privately. Rosalie told him to die professionally and he sat down. 48 minutes later, she was in the back seat of a black car crossing St. Charles beneath wet oak trees beside a man she had technically just married and did not know at all. The city had gone silver with rain. Headlights smeared across the windows. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s called Nico, kept his eyes on the road with the expression of someone who had long ago learned that the most useful talent in a powerful household was selective blindness. Mateo sat opposite her. Not beside her, there were facing seats. He had taken the one furthest from the door and nearest the partition, not trapping her, not crowding her, leaving the space by the handle hers without making a performance out of it. Rosalie noticed. She hated that she noticed. "Well," she said into the soft leather and rain. "That was either the most honorable thing I've ever seen or the most sophisticated kidnapping in Louisiana. The second one would have been quicker. Comforting." He nodded once. As though she had said something practical about the weather, she looked at his hands, no ring, scar across the right knuckle, nothing restless in them, nothing reaching. "You had those other debts bought before tonight." "Yes, how many?" "3. She turned her head. There were 4 women by the curtain. The 4th had families standing behind her. "Did they?" "No," he said, "but they pretended better." That was the first time she nearly smiled. And it made her angry enough to look out of the window for the rest of the drive. His house was not what she expected. She had spent 7 days imagining a fortress. Something marble and vulgar with gates like a prison and chandeliers like threats. What Nico drove them up to, 10 minutes outside the quarter behind a wall of old brick and climbing fig, was a great narrow house with iron balconies and shuttered windows and a courtyard, split by a stone fountain older than America. Every light on the ground floor was on. Every door she could see stood open. The front hall, the drawing room, the library beyond it. The long sight line all the way to the courtyard where rain silvered the flagstones and the fountain kept pouring as if the weather were none of its business. A woman waited in the hall with her hands folded. She was somewhere in her 70s, slim as a knife, wearing black slacks and a pearl gray blouse, and the expression of a person who had once lost her patience in 1983 and never saw any reason to replace it. "Estelle," Mateo said. "This is Rosalie Marchang. Temporarily Vascari," Estelle said, looking Rosalie over with the clinical precision of a tailor and a battlefield nurse. "You haven't eaten since noon," Rosalie blinked. "I'm not." That wasn't the question. Estelle turned and started down the hall. "There's fish soup." "Sit before you fold in half." Rosalie stood in the middle of the front hall holding the small case she had packed with 3 dresses and a toothbrush and felt. To her horror, something in her chest cracked open at the words "there's fish soup." Not the opera house, not the contract, not the ringless marriage soup. A stranger saying "sit before you fold in half" as if her body were not an administrative detail. She did not cry in front of them. She got as far as the kitchen arch and then looked up and saw Mateo had noticed and was conducting himself with the very decent discipline of a man determined not to mention it. He set something on the table in front of her. A brass fob on a leather cord. "What is this?" she said. "Front gate code, side gate code. Alarm bypass for the East Hall. If you leave, nobody stops you. If you come back at 3 in the morning, you can get in without asking anyone." Rosalie went still. He seemed to realize what the stillness meant and added, in the same even tone, "There are no locked interior doors in this house. If you find one shut, it sticks in the humidity. Push harder." She looked past him down the hall. Every door stood open. All of them? All of them. Why? The faintest shift crossed his face, not quite expression. More like weather deciding whether to turn, because closed doors should belong to the person on the inside. He said, "Not the one outside." She looked at the leather cord in her palm for a long moment. Then Estelle put a bowl in front of her and said, "Eat while the men are still being tolerable." And Rosalie laughed into the steam by accident. That was night 1, by dawn 3. She knew 5 things about Mateo Vascari. First, he rose at 4:40 every morning as if obeying an old wound. Second, he hated being approached from behind and disguised this so well, most people probably mistook it for arrogance. Third, he signed papers in blue-black ink and tore off the bottoms of envelopes with mathematical neatness. Fourth, he drank espresso like medicine. And fifth, every door in the house did in fact remain open. Not theatrically, not for her benefit alone. Habitually, the study doors, the library doors, the little linen room off the stairs, his office at the back of the courtyard, where men came and went all day with folders and lowered voices and never once shut the door behind them. The first 2 nights Rosalie tested it, not because she thought he was lying. Because people who mean power well are often the ones who mean it longest. She walked the halls in socks after midnight. She checked the back stair. She looked into the music room. The narrow room with the green wallpaper, the pantry. The book room upstairs that smelled of dust and lemon oil. Open, open, open. At the north end of the second floor, there was one door wider than the others. Painted dark blue, standing open onto a room no one slept in. White sheets over furniture. A dressmaker's dummy in the corner. A cedar chest. Rosalie did not go in because the room had the hush of a place people still talked around. On morning 4, she made the mistake of wandering into the kitchen at 3:10, because her body still believed flour and darkness belonged together. The kitchen was enormous and almost entirely unused in the ways rich kitchens usually are. Copper hung bright and innocent overhead. The marble counters were clean enough to host surgery. There were 3 ovens, a proofing drawer, a mixer the size of a compact car, and exactly one area of the long butcher's block that showed honestsware. Somebody in this house worked at a very specific hour, on a very specific patch of wood, and nowhere else. Rosalie was standing there with one palm on it when Matteo came in. He had no jacket, only a white shirt with the sleeves rolled. Hair damp from a shower, bare feet. He stopped when he saw her, then, because apparently terrifying underworld men are still men, he said, "I was making toast." Rosalie looked at the charred rectangle on the plate behind him. "That's roofing material." He glanced back. "It's bread. It was bread. It tastes the same." There are moments in life so ridiculous they puncture fear all at once. Rosalie, who had been sold to a man by her own brother under chandeliers 3 nights earlier, crossed her arms and said, "If that sentence is true, your childhood failed you." He looked at her, really looked. Then something happened to his face she had not known it could do. He laughed, not elegantly, not often practiced. A short, surprised sound, rusty around the edges. Like a hinge giving way after a locked season, in the doorway behind him. Estelle stopped with a basket of laundry and said to absolutely nobody, "Well, that's new." It turned out Matteo Vescari could run shipping, politics and men with guns. He could not make coffee. He was using water too hot and grounds too fine and looking at the mocha pot with the same grim concentration other men reserved for explosives. "Give me that," Rosalie said on morning 5. He handed it over at once. That irritated her more than argument would have. "How long have you been doing it wrong?" "Since I was 14. And no one corrected you. People generally value their employment." She set the flame lower. "How have you lived this long?" Extortion, favor trading, excellent tailoring. That was the first joke he ever made on purpose. It was dry enough to be almost invisible. But Rosalie saw it, so did Estelle, who oversalted the eggs 5 minutes later because she was paying attention to the wrong miracle. By the end of the first week, Rosalie had also learned the house kept odd hours. Nico the driver was always awake by 5 and spoke to the fountain when he thought nobody was listening. Estelle had opinions about butter that bordered on theology. Men came through the courtyard at all hours with the posture of people bringing Matteo unpleasant facts. Some left relieved, some left pale. Nobody in the house called Rosalie Mrs. Vescari, nobody touched her, and Matteo, for all his easy command of everything outside himself, never once stood between her and a doorway. That last thing became impossible not to notice. If she entered a room, he shifted. If conversation carried them too close to a threshold, he stepped aside without doing it theatrically. At dinner, he chose the chair that left hers nearest open space. In the car, he took the forward seat so she could have the door and the window and the first look at the road. At first, Rosalie thought it was etiquette. By the 8th day, she understood it was fear, not fear of her, fear for her, and then, on the 9th night, she discovered something stranger. A storm came in hard off the Gulf, the kind that rattles shutters and turns the old city briefly biblical. The staff closed the courtyard awnings. Nico checked the generator. Estelle lit 2 extra lamps and muttered about the incompetence of modern roofing. At 11:18, the wind kicked one of the upstairs balcony doors shut. The sound cracked through the house like a gunshot. Rosalie was in the library. She heard the door slam. Then she heard another sound from the corridor outside, not loud, not dramatic, but wrong. A chair leg scraping, a breath cut short. Something wooden striking plaster. She stepped into the hall and saw Matteo at the far end by the stair landing with one hand braced flat against the wall. He was not panicking the way films lie about panic. He was standing very still, too still. The kind of stillness that means a body has gone elsewhere and is deciding whether to take the rest of you with it. Matteo, she said. He did not look at her. Open it. The balcony? Yes. Rosalie crossed the hall, yanked the swollen door hard. And the rain-cold air hit them both at once. Matteo inhaled like a drowning man who had suddenly remembered the arrangement. He stayed where he was. After a moment he said, with infuriating composure, "Thank you." Rosalie leaned against the open doorframe. Wet wind blowing her hair across her face. "That wasn't about a door," she said. "No, do you want to tell me what it was about?" No, there was a long pause then. Because some part of him apparently objected to leaving kindness unpaid, he added, "I was 8. There was a storage cellar beneath a cannery in Plaquemines Parish. My uncle thought it was safer if I waited there during an argument." Rosalie said nothing. "When they remembered me," Matteo went on, still looking into the rain-black courtyard. It was morning. The storm thudded against the awning. Rosalie kept her voice level, the way she used to when one of her bakers had sliced a palm and was pretending otherwise. "How long?" 9 hours. She closed her eyes briefly. "There were no windows," he said. "Just a steel door and the sound of men discovering one another above me." He said it almost lightly. "That made it worse, Matteo." He laughed once under his breath. But there was no humor in it. I know how old I am. I know how doors work. My body remains unconvinced." Rosalie stood in the draft a long moment. Then she said, "That's not weakness." "No?" "No, that's memory with no sense of calendar." He turned then. Really turned. Something in his face changed very quietly. As if a lock somewhere internal had been tried with the correct key by accident. "No one has ever said it like that," he said. "Then you need smarter people." It was not the right answer to a revelation that intimate. It was exactly the answer he needed. He looked at her a second longer, rain moving behind him. And for the first time since the opera house, Rosalie had the dangerous sensation that she was not being observed by a powerful man, she was being seen by a lonely one. After that the house altered, not outwardly. Outwardly it remained the same old iron balconied beast with the fountain and the open doors and Estelle waging private war on anybody who disrespected a saucepan. But the atmosphere changed in tiny, almost embarrassing ways. Matteo began coming into the kitchen when she baked at strange hours, not to watch, exactly, to be near it. On the 11th night, he found her elbow deep in brioche dough because sleep had become impossible and bread at least required obedience from the hands. "What is that?" he said from the doorway. "And why does it smell like forgiveness?" Rosalie looked up. "Butter! That can't be all. Mostly butter, some flour, eggs, regret." Timing. He came in and sat at the far end of the butcher's block where the wood was marked with old work. "You do that with your palms," he said after a minute. "What, the folding?" "It's dough. My mother used to knead like that." Rosalie kept her hands moving because his voice had shifted and she had the strong feeling if she looked up too soon he would stop. "She baked?" "At night, before dawn mostly." He watched the dough take shape under her hands. She said the city was honest then. Rosalie did look up at that. "All cities are most honest before the respectable people wake up," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. He stayed there until the dough was tucked into its bowl and covered with linen. Did not crowd, did not explain himself. Just sat in the warm kitchen at 1 in the morning with his sleeves rolled in his coffee. going cold while Rosalie cleaned flour from the marble and listened to him breathe more evenly than he ever did in daylight. That same week the house received a visitor. Her name was Alessandra Conti. She was 34, sharp-eyed. Old money from a family so respectable they were practically laundering history instead of cash. And she had known Matteo since they were both young enough to mistake damage for charisma. She arrived at noon in a cream suit that would have survived neither weather nor honesty. Kissed Estelle on both cheeks, called Nico by his first name, and looked at Rosalie with neither pity nor curiosity, which made her instantly more dangerous. Over lunch in the courtyard, Alessandra said, very calmly, "They're offering you terms." Matteo did not look up from his plate. "I'm sure they are." "They want the Marchang arrangement dissolved quietly and replaced with something cleaner." "Cleaner for whom?" "Everyone who doesn't like the precedent." Rosalie set down her fork. Alessandra glanced at her then, not unkindly. "I'm not here to insult you." "No," Rosalie said. "You're here to describe me politely." That got her a brief, tired smile. "I'm here," Alessandra said, "because 3 old men think if Matteo married me instead, the room in the opera house becomes an anecdote instead of a fracture." Matteo's face did not change. "You should say yes," Rosalie said before she could stop herself. The words landed badly. Matteo looked at her then. Alessandra looked between them, and because she was not stupid, understood something almost immediately. "Oh," she said softly. Nobody spoke for a second. Then Alessandra did something Rosalie would remember for the next decade with a kind of gratitude. She turned to Matteo and said, "You moved your chair." Rosalie frowned. "What?" Alessandra gestured lightly with her glass. "At dinner last winter he never once sat with his back to the courtyard gate. Not once in 15 years. She looked at Matteo. "Today he's done it twice." Matteo's jaw tightened. Rosalie went very still. Alessandra rose a minute later, set down her napkin, and said to Rosalie on her way out, "He is not a simple man. But he is a literal one. If he said choice, he meant choice." Then she kissed Matteo's cheek like an old friend and left the house carrying 3 generations of suitable expectations out with her. Rosalie did not sleep well that night. By the 14th day, she broke the rule of not asking. The room at the north end of the 2nd floor had gone on existing at the edge of her attention long enough. She found Matteo in the courtyard just after sunset. Sleeves rolled, jacket over one shoulder, reading something he was clearly not reading. "The blue room," she said. He looked up. "That's direct. I own a bakery. I wake up at 2:30. I don't have energy for strategy after 6. He regarded her for a moment. Then he said, "Come on." The room smelled faintly of cedar and dried lavender. No ghostly nonsense, no preserved tragedy laid out like a museum. Just a room kept ready for a person who had been gone too long to need it and too loved to be packed away. A narrow bed, a vanity with a silver-backed brush, 3 paperbacks in Italian, a sewing basket. A framed black and white photograph of a woman with dark hair and a serious mouth standing beside a younger Matteo on a dock, both of them squinting into sun. On the small work table near the window sat a breadboard polished by years of use. Rosalie looked at it once and knew. "Your mother." He nodded. "She came here at 19, he said. "My grandfather settled a shipping debt by taking a bride from a family that had run out of land and sons before they ran out of daughters." Rosalie did not move. She learned the house, learned the silver, learned which of my father's moods meant silence and which meant storms. She learned enough French to speak to the old women and enough English to be polite at the right tables. They called her fortunate because she wore silk and lived behind gates. His voice stayed level. That was the mercy and the damage of it. She used to bake before dawn because nobody asked questions at that hour. She said dough was honest. You could ruin it and it would tell you immediately. Men took longer. Rosalie smiled despite herself, then covered her mouth because of where they were. Matteo noticed and almost smiled too. "She stayed in this house 27 years, he said. "And I don't know if she ever once belonged to it or to herself. I know she belonged to me." That was different. Rosalie looked at the breadboard again. "So when you saw my name in the ledger, I saw hers. that settled into the room between them like weather moving in. He leaned a shoulder against the doorframe.
Careful not to block it. I'm not pretending virtue, Rosalie. I've done too many things the decent version of me would dislike on sight. But there are some machines a man recognizes because they once ate part of his own house. That room at the opera. He looked away for the first time. I saw it too young. I was old enough this time to interfere. Rosalie did not trust her voice for a second. When she found it, she said, "And you thought the best way to save me from being arranged was to arrange me yourself?" He looked back at her. Yes. The honesty of it was almost obscene. She laughed once under her breath. That is the most aggravating sentence I have ever heard. I know. Do you? Constantly. That should not have been funny. It was. 3 days later she found the papers. This is where stories usually cheat and make discovery theatrical. It wasn't. There was no hidden safe behind a painting. No whispered warning from a servant in a stairwell. Matteo had told her on the first night there were no locked rooms and no locked terms. He had meant that literally too. The documents were in his study in a tray marked property. In his exact blue-black handwriting, because apparently secret sacrifices are still often filed alphabetically. Rosalie had gone looking for an envelope, nothing more. Instead, she found the deed to 917 Dauphine, the bakery building, transferred from a shell company into her full legal name. Free and clear, dated 6 days earlier. She sat down very slowly. There was more, the apartment above it, restored. The delivery van debt extinguished, insurance claims paid. A line item for kitchen repairs so specific it included the cracked tile by the back oven she had once mentioned. Offhand in the courtyard while talking about completely different grief. He had not just protected her, he had rebuilt her exit. And he had done it without telling her because, as on every other occasion, Matteo Vascari had found a way to be magnificent and infuriating in the same breath. He came home just after 8. Rosalie was waiting in the study with the papers laid across the desk and all the dangerous calm of a woman who has spent many years managing boiling sugar. He took in the room in one glance, the deed, the repair invoices, her face. Then he set down his keys and said, "All right, that more than denial would have." Almost finished her, "All right? You found them. You bought my life back." "No," he said quickly. "I bought your building back." That is not a better sentence. He nodded once. "I know." Rosalie stood. "You told me there would be 40 days and then choice. There will. You do understand that spending a fortune on someone in private is still a kind of hand around the throat." Something hit behind his eyes at that, but he did not flinch from it. "Yes," he said. "Don't agree with me." "I'm furious. I know. Stop saying you know." "All right." That nearly made her throw a ledger at him. She put both hands flat on the desk instead. "You didn't tell me because you knew I'd refuse." "Yes. So you made refusal impossible." He was silent for a beat too long. Then, very quietly, "I made refusal expensive." Rosalie stared at him. "There is a difference," he said, though his voice suggested he knew it was not enough of one. "For bankers maybe. For people who have never been cornered." "Yes." The room went still. Then he said the thing that made her angrier than everything else. "If you tear up every page on that desk, the building stays yours." Rosalie let out one short laugh with no humor in it at all. Do you hear yourself? You do a thing so large I can't look at it directly. And then you stand there telling me I'm free because I'm permitted to destroy the receipt." His mouth tightened. "That's fair." "No, Matteo. Fair would have been asking me. Fair would have been saying, Rosalie, here is the world as I can influence it. What part do you want?" He looked at the desk, not at her. "My mother spent half her life having things done to protect her," he said after a moment. "Houses, staff, accounts, jewelry, security, comfort. Men called it love because they were pleased with themselves. I swore I would never do that." Rosalie's voice went quiet. And yet, he said, with the exhausted honesty of a man who had run out of better lies. "You told me about the bakery floor like you were talking about a body in hospice. And I could fix that one thing, so I did.
The fight ended not with resolution but exhaustion. Which is how the worst ones often end. Rosalie went upstairs and did not come down for almost 2 days.
Estelle brought soup twice and opinions once.
Nico left a newspaper by her door and pretended it had happened accidentally. Matteo did not knock. That mattered more than an apology would have. On the 19th night,
Rosalie came down at 1:12.
because anger is difficult to sustain on an empty stomach and because some stubborn part of her had begun to miss the sound of another insomniac in the kitchen. The house was mostly dark except for the low lamps in the corridor and the yellow pool over the butcher's block. Matteo was there, not working, not reading. Sitting with an untouched glass of water, and the look of a man who had been holding conversation with the table for some time and losing. Rosalie stood in the doorway.
I'm still angry,
she said. You should be. I may remain angry for months. He looked up then. And something in his face moved very slightly at the word months. All right, he said. She crossed to the kettle. Filled it, put it on. After a minute she said, There's going to be a meeting. He did not pretend not to know which one. Yes, when? Thursday, and they're going to try to take everything off you. Yes, you were going to go alone. Yes. Rosalie turned from the stove. No, he was quiet for a second. No what? No. You do not get to walk into a room full of old men with folders and let them narrate me like weather. It will not help if you're there. That sounds like a sentence a man says when help would look embarrassing, at that. Despite himself, he almost smiled. Rosalie. Don't Rosalie me. I am coming. He sat back in the chair and looked at her. Properly looked. The way he had in the opera house and the storm in his mother's room. Finally he said, The true reason? What? The true reason I don't want you there. She waited. If they strip me in front of you, Matteo said, his voice very steady. I would prefer not to watch your face while it happens. That landed so cleanly it took the room with it.
Rosalie turned off the kettle before it screamed because some people keep functioning during emotional injury out of habit and
because tea is a useful thing to do with your hands. When a man has just handed you the softest part of his pride with no wrapping on it. She set 2 cups on the table. Then she said, That is exactly why I'm coming. The meeting took place back in the opera house. Of course it did. Old power likes old rooms. It likes good acoustics for bad decisions. The chandeliers were lit. The curtains were drawn. 31 people sat at the long walnut table and another 20 lined the walls, pretending not to be part of history, while inhaling every second of it. Renard Gallo sat at the head with the red ledger and a silver pen, and the same expression he had worn the night. Rosalie's life had nearly been itemized into someone else's pocket. When she entered at Matteo's left in a dark coat and plain heels and no attempt whatsoever to look like anything other than herself. There was a visible movement through the room. Renard's brows rose. Mrs. Viscari. This is a private council. Rosalie looked him dead in the face. Then stopped discussing me in public. That bought her 3 full seconds of silence. Which in a room like that was practically a standing ovation. The charges, when read aloud, were exactly the kind of charges powerful men prefer, not monstrous enough to shame them. Just bureaucratic enough to seem inevitable, unauthorized assumption of debts. Interference with traditional settlements. Destabilization of established obligations, financial injury to 4-member families. Conduct likely to encourage future non-compliance. Rosalie stood beside Matteo and thought, they could set a kidnapping to chamber music and call it non-compliance. When it was Matteo's turn to speak, he did not defend himself the way the room expected. He stood, put one hand on the back of his chair, looked at Renard, then the ledger, then the men who had built their comfort out of inherited arrangements and careful language. Everything read into the record is accurate, he said. I acquired the notes. I dissolved the claims. I did it without consultation, and I would do it again before lunch. A muscle moved in Renard's cheek. You are not being asked for wit. No, Matteo said. I'm being asked for regret. He glanced at Rosalie once. Just once. I don't have any. The vote began. One by one, low voices. Clean suits.
The special cowardice of orderly ruin, against.
One abstention from a man who could not look directly at either of them. Against, by the seventh no, Rosalie understood they were not there to persuade. They were there to make the punishment ceremonial, by the ninth.
She saw Nico in the back by the wall with his jaw set like stone, by the 10th. Estelle had somehow appeared in the side aisle in black silk and fury, by the 11th.
Rosalie stopped listening to the word and began listening for something else entirely. Not rescue cost who was accosting, and then, just as Reynard lifted his pen for the formal close, the rear doors opened. 5 women came in. Not the same women from the night Rosalie was sold. That would have been too neat for life and too convenient for truth. These were other women. A florist from Metairie whose ex-husband had once tried to settle a casino debt against her inheritance. A widow from Gretna whose late husband's partners had leaned on her house until Mateo's lawyers made them discover conscience.
A bartender from Baton Rouge,
who had spent 3 months being followed after refusing to marry clean, into a family that wanted her father's trucking route.
And the girl in silver shoes from the first night,
whose name turned out to be Tessa Bellucci, and who now wore boots, a navy coat,
and the expression of somebody no longer interested in dying politely.
No one had invited them, that was the point. Reynard rose half an inch in his chair. "This is irregular," the widow from Gretna said. "So was selling me with my husband's watch still in the drawer." The room changed.
Not morally, rooms like that seldom do anything as dramatic as morality all at once. But it changed strategically. Men who had prepared themselves to strip one of their own in front of other men had not prepared to do it, while women who remembered were standing there using full sentences. Tessa went first. She did not cry, she did not shout. She stood at the end of the long table and said, "On the 11th of October. I was told a contract would decide what happened to my body because my father had signed badly and my brothers had signed worse. Then Matteo Vescari bought the paper and set it on fire in legal language. I am here because your minutes will record whatever you like. But I wanted at least one room in this city to hear the correct version before you bury it alive." After her, the florist spoke. Then the bartender. Then the widow, who said, "You are not voting on whether he broke custom. You are voting on whether custom deserved to live." Nobody at the long table looked comfortable after that. Reynard looked 90. Matteo had not moved. Rosalie could feel the force of his stillness beside her like heat off metal. Then, because apparently the evening had decided to stop pretending, Estelle spoke from the aisle. "I have fed your fathers," she said. "I have buried better men than most of you have managed to become. If one more person in this room calls coercion tradition, I will start naming names from 1978. That caused actual panic in 3 corners of the opera house." Rosalie, against all reason, nearly laughed. The vote did not reverse. That matters. Stories like this are often told badly by people who cannot bear a mixed ending and therefore sand it smooth into victory. But power rarely falls all at once, and decent men are not rewarded on schedule. The vote stood. Matteo lost roots, contracts, recognition in 2 parishes, and enough old alliances to make newspapers whisper around the edges. Without ever printing a useful noun, the room punished him. It simply failed to do so cleanly. Because after the women spoke, after Estelle unsheathed the last 40 years like cutlery, after Rosalie stood and said, very clearly, "He made the door mine," something was altered in a way no vote could fully repair. You could feel it in the way half the men at the wall stopped meeting Reynard's eye. You could feel it in the way Nico, driving them home under the wet black oaks, gripped the wheel with one hand and said after 20 minutes of silence, "For what it's worth, sir. Your father would have hated this outcome." Matteo stared out of the window. "Yes," Nico nodded. "Good, that was all." Rosalie turned her face to the glass so neither of them saw her smile. The annulment was scheduled for the next morning. Of course it was, because Matteo Vescari, having lost half a kingdom in one night, was still going to keep the one promise he had made under chandeliers to a woman in black silk 7 weeks earlier. Rosalie woke at 6 to find the house already in motion. A garment bag by the stairs, coffee in the kitchen, The deed packet on the table beside a cream envelope with her name in Mateo's hand. He was in the courtyard in a dark coat, speaking quietly into a phone, posture controlled down to the fingertips. When he saw her, he ended the call at once. "The judge moved us to 10, he said. "Traffic's ugly near Canal." Rosalie stood in the kitchen arch looking at him. "All right," she said. He nodded once, as if she had accepted a business appointment, and not the formal dismantling of the most dangerous and careful thing that had ever happened to either of them. At the courthouse, he walked half a pace behind her. Not ownership, not distance, something harder, restraint under load. The judge was brisk, the clerk sleepy. The room fluorescent and heartbreakingly ordinary. The documents were in order. Mateo had signed his side 3 days earlier in the neat blue-black hand Rosalie now recognized anywhere. There was no clause, no condition, no hidden leverage. The property transfer stood independently. The marriage could end cleanly. Her name could become her own again in the eyes of the state, which had of course never had the faintest clue what it had cost to get it there. The pen lay beside the final page. Rosalie looked at it, then at Mateo. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and every muscle in his body behaving itself by force. "If you need a minute," the judge said kindly. Because to him they were simply one more expensive pair in some private mess. Mateo spoke without taking his eyes off the far wall. "Take all the minutes you want." Rosalie picked up the pen. "This is the part where people expect revelation to be dramatic, a choir, a thunderclap, a montage of memory. It wasn't that either. It was smaller and crueler. She remembered the front gate code on the leather cord in her palm the first night. The open doors, the storm, burnt toast. His mother's breadboard, the deed in the study. His infuriating, impossible, catastrophic habit of loving like a man trying not to repeat an old crime, and therefore tripping over new ones. And beneath all of it, the one unbearable fact she had been avoiding because it was simpler to be angry than to be honest. He had never once used her fear to hold her still. Not once, not at the opera house. Not in the kitchen, not after the fight. Not after the vote, not now with his world half collapsed and the easiest argument in the world available to him. Which would have been "Stay. I need you." He said nothing. Because if he had said it, it would not have counted. Rosalie put the pen down. The judge blinked. "I'm sorry," she said. Mateo's face did not change, which only proved how much effort that required. Rosalie turned to the clerk. "Could we have a minute outside, actually?" The judge, now deeply interested in everybody else's mess, nodded at once. They stepped into the corridor. People passed with folders and bad coffee and the ordinary tragedies of tax disputes and custody schedules and parking violations. Outside the high windows, the city carried on being itself. Rude and humid and impossible to impress. Rosalie looked at Mateo. He waited. That was his whole talent in the end, not force, not power. Waiting without moving the outcome with his thumb. "You infuriate me," she said. "Yes, you have spent 6 weeks proving that love and control are not the same thing. And then every third day you behave as though nobody told you. Yes, you bought my bakery. Yes, you let me find out alone. Yes, you make coffee like a negligent uncle." A pause. "Yes, that did it," she laughed once, sharp and wet-eyed. And then, because there was no decent way left to say it, she said, "I cannot tell whether I want to kiss you or throw the deed at your head. I would understand either. That's the problem. Mateo, you understand everything one step too late and one step too deeply." He took that without blinking. Finally, he said, very softly, "Rosalie, if you sign in there, I will drive you to Dauphine myself and leave the keys on the counter, and nobody in this city will ever hear me say a bitter word about it. If you don't sign, I need you to understand I will still ask you the same question I should have asked before I bought anything." She could hear her own pulse now. What question? He looked at her the way a man looks at the edge of a cliff he fully intends to jump from, because the ground behind him has become less survivable than the air. "What life do you want?" Mateo said. "And is there any version of it that has room for me if I learn to stop building it on your behalf?" Rosalie stared at him,
There it was, at last, not a deed.
Not a rescue, not an arrangement, not even devotion, a question. Her whole face changed before she could stop it. He saw? Of course he saw. Damn you, she whispered. I know. No. 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 No.
You really don't. That's possible. She stepped closer. People passed them in the corridor. Nobody cared. Somewhere a copier jammed, somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a clerk said next and a marriage ended or a lease began. The universe has terrible timing and excellent instincts. Rosalie put a hand flat against Mateo's coat over his heart.
He looked down at it as though that ordinary touch might yet prove beyond him.
You said that first night, she said, that I'd never met men your size. He went very still. Yes, I thought you meant power. His voice barely held. What do you think I meant now? She smiled through the wreckage of the morning. A man big enough to leave the door open even when he's terrified I'll walk through it. For a second, Matteo Vascari, who had faced guns, votes, storms, and family history with better posture than most priests manage at funerals,
looked like somebody had reached into his ribs and unfastened something carefully armored there years earlier.
Then Rosalie kissed him in a courthouse corridor at 10:17. In the morning, while two paralegals pretended not to stare and a bailiff very pointedly stared the other way. When she pulled back, Matteo shut his eyes for exactly 1 second and said, in a voice gone rough around the edges, I have waited with unreasonable dignity for that. Rosalie laughed. That was not dignity. That was fear in a very expensive coat. Yes, he said. That too. They did not file the annulment that day.
They also did not turn into idiots. That part matters as well.
Rosalie moved back to the apartment above the bakery 2 weeks later because she wanted to wake up in flour and noise and her own choices. Matteo did not argue. He sent 3 men to repair the back steps, then withdrew them when she said she'd hired her own crew. He learned to ask before arranging.
Not perfectly, not immediately, but honestly,
3 nights a week he had dinner on Dauphine after closing, not always in the kitchen.
Sometimes at the little table by the front window with the bentwood chairs and the traffic outside and the smell of sugar and yeast,
soaked so deeply into the walls that even winter couldn't drive it out. Sometimes he washed trays badly. Sometimes he stood in the doorway while Rosalie counted receipts and read whatever war was currently being fought in his face.
And sometimes she did what nobody had apparently thought to do for him often enough and said,
Tell me straight. He did by spring. Enough old arrangements had gone poisonous in daylight that even Reynard Gallo stopped trying to resurrect the opera house custom as anything respectable. 2 younger families quietly withdrew support. One publicly pretended they had never liked it. This is how cowards usually reform late, noisily. And with excellent memory loss, but reform it was all the same.
The bakery reopened fully in March, under its old name and Rosalie's full ownership and a line out the door most Saturdays. Nico became a regular customer and claimed not to be.
Estelle bullied 3 suppliers into providing better butter and then denied all involvement. Alessandra Conti sent flowers opening week with a note that read, in a hand as elegant as the rest of her, congratulations on choosing the complicated one on purpose. Matteo framed that note in his study and then had to remove it when Rosalie laughed too hard to breathe in June. Because life has a vulgar sense of humor, and because no human being deserves complete emotional safety all at once.
Matteo attempted to make croissants for Rosalie's birthday. He did this in secret, which was his first mistake.
His second mistake was believing laminated dough would respect him because lesser men did. At 4:20 in the morning, Rosalie came downstairs to find the kitchen looking like a butter-based insurrection. Flour in his hair, apron tied crooked, a rolling pin on the floor. Dough slumping off the marble in a gesture of profound disappointment. She stopped in the doorway. Matteo did not turn around. Before you say anything, he said to the oven,
I want it noted that the recipe is badly written and the butter is vindictive. Rosalie folded
her arms. The butter is French. It's just better than you. He turned then, holding half a tray of what might with compassion be called attempts.
There was a long silence. Then Rosalie began to laugh.
Not polite laughter, not loving mercy, full helpless collapse against the doorframe laughter. The kind that arrives when a person has been frightened too long for too many months and suddenly sees the ridiculous shape of survival in front of her wearing an apron that says, "Kiss the cook" in gold lettering Estelle had clearly selected as an act of war. Mateo waded through all of it with what dignity remained. Finally he said, "Are you done?" Not remotely. He looked at the ruined tray. "For the record, I did burn 3 empires more efficiently than this." Rosalie wiped her eyes. "Yes, but those did not require lamination," he considered that. Then, to her everlasting delight, he nodded. "Fair that September they married for real. Not in an opera house, not in a ballroom, not under chandeliers. In the courtyard of the old house with the fountain still talking to itself, and the iron balconies warm from the day and every door on the ground floor standing open to the evening air." Nico wore a tie and hated it. Estelle wore dark blue silk and cried only once, then denied it. Alessandra came with a gift so tasteful it irritated everyone. Rosalie wrote her vows in pencil on the back of an invoice and never recopied them. Mateo did not bring notes at all. He looked at her in front of everyone who mattered and said, "I will ask before I act. I will answer plainly. I will never confuse protecting you with deciding for you. And if there is ever a door in front of us, my hand will be on the handle. Not the lock. There are better vows. Probably not for them." When it was Rosalie's turn, she took both his hands because she could, and because choice remained the most romantic thing he had ever given her. Then she said, "I will tell you when you are being noble in the stupid direction. I will correct your coffee until death parts us. I will not let fear do all your thinking. And when the old rooms in your head go dark, I will stand in the doorway until you remember what year it is." Mateo laughed once, helplessly, and half the courtyard cried on principle. Much later, after the cake had survived and the music had gone low and the city had turned itself gold around the edges, Rosalie found him alone for a minute by the fountain. He had loosened his tie, she had icing on her wrist. Somewhere behind them Estelle was threatening a florist for leaning a ladder against the stucco. Rosalie stepped into his space, touched the white thread at his temple with one finger, and said, "You know, for a man who made a grand speech about size, you've turned out to be very specific." Mateo smiled. "That's because you misunderstood the line." "I did?" "Yes. What was it supposed to mean?" He looked at the open doors of the house, the lit kitchen beyond, the laughter moving in and out of the evening like weather the building had finally decided to trust. Then he looked back at her. "It meant," he said, "that you had met men who wanted to be feared." "I was trying to tell you I wanted to be answerable." Rosalie stared at him for a second. Then she kissed him again because sometimes the only correct response to a sentence that good is to stop the speaker before he ruins it by continuing. And in the kitchen beyond them, where the doors were open and would stay that way, somebody turned on the coffee and the night carried on.